Hello and welcome everyone to day 7 of my descent into madness, also called onset detection. Actually, this is not day 7 as in consecutive days. The first 6 days were consecutive, but now I took a little bit of a break because I was ill, and in this time I had to think about what I want to say in this series. Probably it came a little bit out of the blue from some people. Some of you might even think, what is onset detection? I haven't even explained that properly. Or what are the problems with onset detection? Onset detection is being used when you want to identify peaks. The problem is that no one ever managed to make a perfect onset detector. That is the frustrating part about it. Like if you want to use a compressor, you can use a compressor on everything. Hey everyone, this is me from editing. I thought I add a little bit of an explanation to this statement of mine that I said that transient detection has not been perfect yet, because that is kind of vague. What I mean by that specifically will be demonstrated now. Check out this beat. So yeah, in this beat I made some very clear transients with the kicks. You can really see where they are. So, you know, you would expect a transient shaper to actually pick that up. But if I enable kilohertz transient shaper and set it up so that it has basically a setting that just lets through the transient and then it goes down to silence as much as it can. Okay, so first of all, you can see it definitely detected where the transients are, but only for the very strong drums, like the snare and the kick, and everything else is like very far in the background. And then we also have these big spikes in volume sometimes. That is not a very friendly signal to mix. If the bass wasn't there, it would also pick up those hi-hats, because this plugin tends to be confused by bass melodies, because it has an onset detector that is very good, but it does not filter out the low frequencies. And then there is Spiff, which is a spectral transient shaper, and it sounds like this. You can immediately hear that the sound has a much more consistent volume, which makes it very easy to use in the mix. And it also always picks up every single kinds of transients, like not just the kicks, but also the hi-hats and everything at the right volume and stuff. The only problem is, because it's a spectral effect, it has a lot of pre-ringing. Like sometimes the kick, it fades in as much as it fades out, you know? So that could be undesirable, of course. But yeah, that's the trade-off of transient shapers, basically. Either you make them in the time domain and they are like super imprecise and miss a lot of transients in a weird way, or you make them in the spectral domain and it's like super pre-ringing and not always what you want to use, especially if you are measuring the onsets for some other effect than volume shaping. Like you could use it to quantize audio in time or something. In that case, you would want to have specific sample indexes and not just an approximation from the frequency domain, I think. So yeah, that is the compromise that you always find in transient shapers and plugins in general that depend on onset detection. So it's hit or miss, it's 100% or 0% right. That makes it much more of a tricky thing than a compressor, which could be a little bit odd overall, but it would at least be consistently odd, while an onset detection would always stand out when it's kind of weird, because maybe there is a transient and you expect it to hit and then suddenly it doesn't hit and you're like, Or maybe you're just listening peacefully and suddenly it detects a transient where you wouldn't expect it and you're like, huh? You know, that's the tricky thing about onset detection. And there's one thing that you have to decide when you make good onset detection, which is what is more important to you. Do you want it to fire a little bit more rapidly and sometimes even find transients where there are none? Or do you want it to be more cautiously and it will miss a few transients, but at least every time it finds a transient, it is actually a transient. So as you can see here, there is a beat. When I enable my plugin, every time it detects a transient, it will spawn a little bit of a spike. Okay, so here's the first thing that I find interesting. It finds a transient here where there is definitely a transient, but it's not coming from the drums. It is just coming from this instrument. So interestingly, when we play the sound without the drums, it still finds transients, maybe even more so in this instrument than when the drums are overlaid, because then the drums are overshadowing the transients of this instrument. So yeah, the transient detection works. It is very cautious at the moment, doesn't find wrong transients. It misses a few transients sometimes when those rims hit that I have here in the background, those fill-ins. When I play them solo, it finds all of the transients, but with everything together, it can be a little bit complicated. I have some things in here on purpose that are diffusing the algorithm a little bit. Like this roomy sound, which is mixed in with everything, so makes it a little bit more reverby. We have this bass. You've already seen it sometimes missing a peak here, but what I really like about this, for example, is that it doesn't identify a peak here. Like this could be seen as a peak maybe. If you are creative, you could say, well, this could be sort of a peak, but my peak detection correctly identifies that this is not a peak, which is cool. I like that. So yeah, it's really good at this point, and I want to show you what I did in the meantime. First of all, I removed the two parameters Decay0 and Decay1 because I identified that they had a common ratio that just works very well. So if Decay0 is like 35% of what Decay1 is, then it is good. That is what I found out. It looks awfully close to pi. Maybe it should just be pi. I don't know. Like mathematically could be. So I made this method set decay instead of what I had before, was setting decay for Decay1 and Decay2 individually with a second parameter. But now it's just one method setting the decay, and then it sets the decay for Decay1, and then it calculates Decay0, and then it sets the decay for Decay0 for all of the individual detectors. Just a little reminder, there are 16 detectors in here that can be switched around with this value. A little bit earlier I had it on a higher value. I put it down a little bit, and for some reason that gave me even better results. So this should also be made into a parameter at some point to experiment what is the perfect point for the number of bands. The number of bands are scattered across a spectrum with the lowest frequency and the highest frequency setting the range. So that should also become a parameter at some point, because I played around with this a little bit as well, and it also improved the thing. But if it was a parameter, I could find out where the exact values are better. These were just educated guesses, because you know, transients are often living in the high end. There you can at least hear them the best. So I felt like, okay, let's just skip all of the low end stuff and only identify peaks in the high end. That will make a lot of things easier. Probably also the reason why it didn't identify a transient on that baseline where it was swelling in from the sidechain pumping, which is very good, exactly what I want, so perfect. Another thing that I did was I added a new parameter, set bandwidth, but this is the bandwidth of the onset detector that has the bands, not the small onset detector that is just consisting of the bandpass filter with the envelope followers. So this means a different thing. It means bandwidth percentage actually. So there will go something in here like, let's say 1, which would be 100%, and then it sets this value and updates the bandwidth. Now this method is taking the bandwidth in hertz, multiplying it with the bandwidth in percent, and only then setting the resonance. And those are different values because in the bigger onset detector I'm setting this range and it's calculated in the prepare to play method. There it is given the frequency hertz and bandwidth hertz values that every detector just has in general. And yeah, when this becomes a parameter, this has to go somewhere else, of course, but at the moment it is fixed, so it's in prepare to play. And then on top of that, there is this parameter which can reshape the bandwidth for all of the detectors all together so that they are a little bit less of what was calculated here or even more. Like if you go below 1 with the percentage, then that would mean that the bandwidth is getting smaller than the difference between the highest and the lowest frequency of where you currently are in this loop. And if you go higher, then it's going higher than that. And when I implemented this parameter, I found out that going to around minus 200% bandwidth actually works better than whatever I came up with as the calculation here. So that's why I make parameters out of my things, to find out if I'm wrong about something with the assumptions that I'm making here. So yeah, that's how I'm experimenting to find the best onset detection. And one really important thing to note here is that at some point I just have to call it a day. I just have to be done with it. Because as I said earlier, onset detection is just never going to be perfect. It's always a little bit weird. There's always some signal that just says nope. And even then, even though it is frustrating that this is an algorithm that has this flaw, this fundamental flaw in its very nature, so to say, at some point I just have to say, okay, good enough. And that's, yeah, I don't like that. It's different with vibratos and with resonators. They are just doing their thing. They are always doing it as good as they can. I like that. But onset detectors, it requires a different mindset to finish something like that.